Hi, everyone. Welcome to 3GNY Stories Live, WEDU Wednesday. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Lindsay Kamens, 3GNY board member and volunteer speaker. I'm also the granddaughter of Holocaust refugees Rudolph and Trudy Hers. This is our 29th WEDU Wednesday, our virtual series that brings our educational initiative, WEDU, from classrooms to your living rooms. We are so glad to have you here for this special WEDU Wednesday program, and we look forward to having you join us for more in the future. And a special shout out to our teachers from Nevada who are joining us tonight for the first time. We're glad you're here and look forward to working with you in the future. I would also like to acknowledge that on this day, September 11th, we remember and honor those that we lost and the sacrifices made. We will never forget. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. We empower 3Gs to share their stories. For tonight's event, we'll be featuring 3GNY volunteer Ariele Schwartz, who will share the story of her grandfather, Harry Schwartz, from cast-off to Cornerstone, a grandfather's journey of resilience. Tonight is an extra special program too, as we honor the memory of Lillian Berliner, grandmother of one of our longtime volunteers, Lauren Engelman. Tonight's program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. WEDU empowers grandchildren of survivors to compellingly share their families' Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. Education is more important and more urgent than ever, given the horrifying rise of anti-Semitism we see in the headlines and in our communities on a daily basis. We know we need to keep doing this work as much as we possibly can. Studies have shown that students who receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Through our grandparents' stories, we provide a human face to the past and a living link to the present, inspiring our listeners to stand up to hatred and to act with courage and compassion. 3GNY has trained more than 500 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and around the country. We've shared our stories in more than 1,500 classrooms and have impacted more than 60,000 students and community members. And between our live programming and YouTube channel, more than 18,000 additional people have heard our stories. Hope is not lost, and we need to keep doing this work now more than ever. You can help us accomplish this through a financial gift. This will go directly toward engaging more speakers and schools, thus reaching even more students with these impactful stories. We do not solicit donations from schools, teachers, or students. We provide our programming to schools completely free in order to remove any barriers from connecting students with moving personal testimony from the Holocaust. There is a link with ways to donate in the chat, and we hope you'll consider making a gift. If you've contributed before, thank you so much. It is because of donors like you that we can educate students and the community about the lessons of the Holocaust through our family's personal stories. It is now my distinct honor to introduce Lauren Engelman, a longtime volunteer with 3GNY. Some of you may recognize Lauren from past webinars and programs, including an event just before COVID that featured her grandma Lily talking about her own experiences during and after the Holocaust. When Lily passed away earlier this year, all of us in the 3GNY community mourned the loss of a wonderful woman so full of light and love. In her final days, she urged her family to never forget her story and the memories of other Nazi victims, including her late father, Albert. We are honored and humbled that Lily's family, including Lauren and her parents, Stephen and Merrill, invited tribute donations to be made to 3GNY in Lillian's memory. To make a gift in Lillian's honor, visit the link in the chat. I'd now like to turn it over to Lauren, who will share a few words about Lillian with us, and then introduce Ariele in our program tonight.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Engelman, the very proud granddaughter of Lillian Berliner. Lillian was born in Cluj-Napoca, Romania, Kohler Hungary in 1926. Both she and her mother, Elizabeth, survived Auschwitz, Bremen labor camp, a death march, and Bergen-Belsen, using positive thinking, determination, and intelligence to survive. Sadly, Lillian's father was killed on the first day of Auschwitz in the gas chambers. Somehow, she always stayed positive and knew in her heart that she would survive. This sense of optimism and desire to put one foot in front of the other stayed with her until she passed. After the war, she met the love of her life, Walter, and had the first Jewish wedding in Frankfurt after the war before immigrating to the US. Once in the United States, Lily continued her schooling, finishing college, getting her master's of public health, and obtaining her licensing in nursing home administration. Later in life, her greatest joy was becoming a grandmother and great-grandmother. And indeed, every holiday and occasion was special with Lily in our lives. She was the most loving and devoted grandmother I could ever ask for. Lillian inspired me to participate with 3GNY over the last decade, where I started off attending social functions looking to meet other 3Gs with similar experiences and partaking in the WEDU program and training. Since 2022, I've been on the events committee and created and now produced an event series titled Jewishness, Activism, and Finding Belonging, which is focused on sharing diverse Holocaust stories and intersectional journeys of survivors after the war. Lillian's memory will always be a blessing and continue to inspire this very, very important work. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Ariele Schwartz. Ariele is the granddaughter of Harry Schwartz. She's named for Harry's brother, her great-uncle Abraham Matthew, who died in Auschwitz. Though she never spoke with her grandfather directly about his experiences, the origin of her name gave them a very special connection. Ariele began telling Harry's story in the fall of 2022 after completing 3GNY's WEDU speaker training program the previous summer. Ariele is no stranger to speaking and teaching. She currently works as a learning and development manager in New York City. She has spent her career in hospitality, starting out as a pastry chef and chocolatier. Baking is still a part of her life, and in his lifetime, her grandfather was one of her most devoted champions and taste testers. I love that. While Ariele is sharing, feel free to please drop your questions into the Q&A feature in the Zoom menu. We will have plenty of time for questions and discussion after Ariele's story. Ariele, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Lindsay, and thank you everyone for having me here tonight. It is my esteemed honor to introduce you, at least in story, to my grandfather, Harry Schwartz, born Zvi Hirsch-Wolf, in Scierpc, Poland. I'll show you a map in case you haven't ever heard of Scierpc, which wouldn't be a surprise to me. Scierpc is a very small town. What in Yiddish we might term a shtetl, more than 2 hours drive from Warsaw. He was born there in a time that now would be, as of this year, about 100 years ago, which means that his birth record would look something like this. But I just show you this to paint a picture of sort of where he was, and what type of place this was. Certainly it was a small hamlet. His father, Labe, was a merchant. At least that's what it says in his birth certificate. By the time of his young childhood, his early life, we imagine that the family had some sort of boarding house, but they certainly had tenants, and a small restaurant where they resided. Maybe that's where the hospitality in me comes from. 2 years after he was born in 1926, came my namesake, my great uncle Abraham. And for all intents and purposes, they had a relatively normal childhood. They went to school, and they went to Jewish day school, but they went to school, they walked every day. The only thing really of note was that they were Polish kids. They went to a Polish day school, and they often taunted the Jewish kids. Bullying would be putting it mildly. Discrimination would probably be more in line with what he was experiencing. But when he would talk about it, he would always talk about that was just the reality of the time. There was no thought that it would ever be any other way, and that there really wasn't a reason to stand up against it because that's just how life was. And his life went on in a relatively normal fashion up through his early teens. He had a bar mitzvah, so he read from the five books of Moses in front of his congregation. His family threw a party. It happened to be a big house party. Some of his gifts were chickens, but still not unlike what we might see today, minus the chickens. And it was shortly after that, we think around the age of roughly 14 or 15, that really everything started to change in a more drastic and in a much more expedient way. Um, it's certainly, tensions in Poland were growing. Certainly Hitler was gaining more power in Germany. And so his family was part um, of a relocation of all the Jews to a ghetto outside of his town. So that would have been his first experience with anything sort of on a grand scale, I believe. But his whole town, all the Jews were relocated roughly to the same place. And then started all the rules, right? He couldn't continue to receive an education. After a time, he had to go to work. And so he did manual labor, sometimes in the ghetto, sometimes outside the ghetto for days or weeks at a time. And so he went from being a relatively normal young adult very quickly to a working, sturdy Jewish adult, or at least in the eyes of the community and in the eyes of the Germans, that's what he was. And during this time, actually, his mother passed away, not because of any discrimination or at any hands of the Germans or the Nazis, but really at the hands of the powers that be. She was very ill, and it was her time. And so from here on out, it's the boys of the Schwartz clan. It was his father, Labe, his brother, Abraham, and himself, along with an uncle and some cousins from both there and from neighboring towns. If we fast forward a little bit and jump us into 1942, certainly that is when most of us think of it being kind of the heart of World War II. My grandfather would have been roughly 18 years old at the time. And in November of that year, my uncle and all of the Jewish people in the ghetto were part of a transport, but this time they were going much further away. This time they were headed to Auschwitz. Now, that's not to say that they knew what Auschwitz was or what that meant, but I do want to illustrate for you what that looked like. So I'm showing you the map I put up earlier that shows you his hometown and its proximity to the nearest big city. But if you look at the second map that I've posted, I put Scierpc in sort of a green dot. That's roughly where it would have been. And if you draw a line straight south, you would hit Auschwitz. And this would be, I wager, the furthest he had ever been from home with or without his family. But this transport was a little different, certainly, than what I think many of you would have expected. I know what is sort of prevalent in the information about the Holocaust is that people were loaded on cattle cars. But this is still relatively early in the days of concentration camps and transports. And so the Germans were using the resources that they had available, which at the time meant luxury passenger cars. And so in a train car that had plush seats and wood moldings, my grandfather and his father and his brother and their friends and family were transported to Auschwitz. Now, he said that in a way, they didn't really know that anything was amiss. How could they? But they did say that there were some clues that he recognized later on, that the moldings of the train car, the wooden moldings and the armrests, had some carvings in them that people had carved their names into the seats and into the walls, as though they wanted people to know they had been there. And so clearly something big was brewing. And ultimately they arrived at Auschwitz, or Auschwitz 1. They got off on the train platform, and then it is exactly as we would have expected, based on common history. First, they went through sorting, a selection where people were divided into groups, you to the right, you to the left, you to the right, you to the left. And in that selection, my great grandfather, Labe, and my great uncle, Abraham, were sent in one direction, and my grandfather and his uncle were sent in the other direction. Now, my grandfather, Harry, couldn't have known at the time, uh, but ultimately, this was the last time that he ever saw them. They were sent to the gas chambers. He would learn that ultimately after some time in the camp, that they were sent up the chimneys, as the saying goes. But at the time, he thought all was going to be fine and they'd be reunited at a later point. From this selection, there were further selections and sortings. And so, in that, um, one of the questions they asked everyone was if they had a profession, a specialty. And in his infinite wisdom, my 18-year-old grandfather, who hadn't had an education since he was 13, said, I would be useful if I had a profession. So I'm going to raise my hand for that. And when they asked him what his profession was, he came out with bricklayer. He did construction work, manual labor. And so he was sorted into another group. And ultimately, he was sorted into another group that had other people sharing his profession. And from this point, they went through sort of the onboarding into the camp, right? They had their heads shaved. They were assigned uniforms. They were tattooed with their numbers, which was done by other prisoners. So his number, which was on his left forearm, was 77487. And that number was there for his entire life, for all the time that I knew him. And then it was day-to-day life in the camp. You wake up every day, 4 or 5 in the morning. They do a roll call, which is like attendance. So they make sure everybody's accounted for. You were sent out to work. Then at the end of the day, you would come back from work. They'd do another roll call and you were sent on your way. And somewhere in there, you got 2 meals, a breakfast of some thing, coffee, maybe a piece of bread, often that had filler like sawdust, and then a small dinner, something akin to a broth if you were lucky with some vegetables or meat in it. And that was all they had for the day. Now, life sort of plugged on day by day. And my grandfather is very much always in his life a person who put one foot in front of the other and focused on what was directly in front of him. And so he lived that way for about his first 6 months in the camp, up until roughly March 1943. And then he got sick. Now, when he got sick, they sent him to the infirmary. I'm sure we would all want that if we weren't feeling well. But the infirmary in Auschwitz wasn't anywhere anybody wanted to go, because that infirmary had a very different aim. Now, there were people there who had some sort of medical background. Most of them were prisoners. And so you were getting some attention and care, but largely it was to determine if you could go back to work, because if you couldn't, you were likely going to be killed at some point in the very near future. So nobody wanted to go there and nobody wanted to stay there. But he went. He was given a fluoroscope, which is something akin to an X-ray. He said it looked like somebody had been playing tic-tac-toes on his lungs. He was diagnosed with pleurisy, which is an upper respiratory illness. And he was kept in the infirmary. So he had a new bunk, he had a new routine, but he wasn't going to work. Now, the remarkable part of this is multifold. First of all, there were people there who did actually take care of him. In fact, there was one doctor, one other prisoner who, in particular, had drained fluid from my grandfather's lungs at least twice that he could remember, but he didn't know that person's name, didn't know him very well, but attributed a lot of his survival in that period to that person, because he was getting proper medical attention. But ultimately, he was in the infirmary for roughly 63 days, more like exactly 63 days. So he didn't come out of the infirmary till May 1943. And this was largely unheard of. So when he re-entered camp life, people that had known him, for them, it was this grand miracle to see him again. For him, it was a little bit the opposite. He was certainly happy to be alive and to be getting back to an area with people he knew and getting back to some kind of normal where he knew what would happen day to day. And then on the other hand, he got some other news that was less positive, which was that his uncle, his now only remaining living blood relative, had watched all this time go by without my grandfather's return, and in that time had lost his hope, hadn't had decided he didn't want to be alone in the world, that he didn't want to try to survive if there was nobody from his family left. And while we don't know exactly what happened, we do know that in those intervening 63 days, he passed away where he was killed. And so my grandfather is now returning to the camp in the situation that his uncle couldn't foresee for himself, which was now he was a young man with no blood relatives, basically in the camp alone, barring some people that he knew from his town. But he didn't necessarily have time to focus on the grief. All he could really do was get back into life and take it one day at a time, which is what he did. Now, my grandfather was in Auschwitz from November 1942 to early January 1945. It was an exceptionally long period of time. In fact, because the number on his arm was only 5 digits, they considered him an old timer for his seniority around the camp. And what was additionally remarkable, at least to me, is that when he was in Auschwitz, while he entered and initially worked in Auschwitz I, he ultimately worked in all the parts of Auschwitz. So I'm showing you a very rough map here. And this is gross generalities, but essentially there were three big parts of Auschwitz separate from all the subcamps. There was Auschwitz I, there was Auschwitz II Birkenau, which is a little bit newer and a bit later in time. That was where women were housed, in addition to several other groups. And then there was Auschwitz III, which was Monowitz or Sosnowitz. This was where you'll see there's a building there labeled IG Farben, but essentially the German war effort had a factory on site in Auschwitz. So in addition to being held captive and watching your loved ones being killed by the Nazis and being put toward very strenuous labor, you would be doing labor that benefited the work effort, the war effort, and the Nazi armies, which I imagine is highly conflicting among other things. But in those years in the camps, he ultimately migrated from one to the other. He spent, I think, about 6 months or so in Auschwitz II, and then his remaining time in the camp in Auschwitz III. And then he was transported again. Now, it does seem a bit late in the game, but at this point, we're in early 1945, and things are turning. Maybe the Germans know they're turning, so they're doing some shuffling around. And one of the things they shuffled was their prisoners. And so what they did was, at least with my grandfather, they shuffled him to another camp called Mauthausen, which I've now highlighted on the map. So again, we're taking him now through a fully different country, far further from his hometown. In Mauthausen, he was given a new number. This one wasn't tattooed, it was actually on his uniform. And before hearing his story, I didn't even know they did that. I just thought you had a number. But his number was 129690. And if you can believe it, for all the notoriety that Auschwitz gets, my grandfather said that Mauthausen was worse. And the reason why was because by the time he got to Mauthausen, there was a lot of filth. There wasn't very much order. And while that sounds very weird to say, understanding the conditions of a concentration camp, in Auschwitz, there was routine. So even though you couldn't get a hot shower and tons of soap and shampoo your hair, once a week you were sent to the showers to clean yourself. Once every other week, they were reshaving your head. And so there was this sort of feeling of routine and cleanliness that existed in the chaos and disorder. And in Mauthausen, there was none of that. And so people really became almost inhuman. They didn't want to make connections. They were gruffer and angrier. And so it was a very challenging place to be. And thankfully, he was really only there 6 or 8 weeks. And then he was transported again. And so for the remainder of his time in the war, he was transported several times. So from Mauthausen, he went to Gusen II, where he worked on armaments. And this is a subcamp of Mauthausen, so it wasn't too far away. And then he was sent to Gunskirchen, which is just a few feet from there. And Gunskirchen ultimately was the camp he was liberated from. Now, we might think of liberation as this big celebration where the American soldiers come in and they're waving flags and giving out chocolate, and that's not what this was. Ultimately, the Germans, understanding that they were now horrifically losing, were trying to destroy and they were trying to get out. And so they did do a march of some people out of Gunskirchen, and the rest remained. But ultimately, my grandfather had decided to leave the camp. That's kind of nothing good could come of staying. And in that march, essentially, which was over several days, one day he went to sleep, and the next day he woke up and the Germans were gone. That's a very simple way of putting it, but essentially they abandoned all the prisoners they had. And so the prisoners were sort of in shock. It was like, where do we go? What do we do? Are they coming back? Are they, is this a trick? And so even though they were free, they weren't really sure they were free. But they did take the risk, a lot of them, to kind of move on. And my grandfather and two men that he was with decided that they would go to a nearby farmhouse, whatever they could find that was abandoned, and get some strength back and get some sleep. And then they would make their next move. Now, he basically had three choices. His first choice was to go home, which, as you can see, was a great many miles away, but there was nothing there for him. So that was out. His second choice, which would have been his top pick, actually, was to go to the state that would eventually become Israel. But there were so many Jews heading toward this potential Jewish homeland, this new Jewish state, that it was very difficult to get there, and there were quotas, and so it became a virtual impossibility. So his other recourse was to go somewhere else, and so he did. He ultimately went south. He went to Italy, to a town in the north that was called Fano. And you can see here, these were his identity papers there. They do identify him as a Polish citizen. But ultimately, he went to a displaced persons camp, a DP camp, and that was where he stayed for a period of time. He did try to go back to school, but found he couldn't sit in a classroom because it just, like, they were too much had happened. It didn't feel important. He just wanted to get on with his life. And so he decided to work, and he worked at the craft he knew, which was bricklaying. So ultimately, that decision he made that first day in the camp became a bigger decision that impacted the whole course of his life. And he lived in Italy for roughly 5 years. He learned to speak Italian, and he really kind of settled in. But at the same time, there were other Jews there in the displaced persons camp. And so he was really working towards figuring out if there were any family left. He had some memory of the fact that his mother had an older brother from a previous marriage whose family had immigrated to a place called New York. And so as people were getting letters and they were seeing Yiddish newspapers from the States, he was asking around, seeing if people knew his family. And somewhere between that and the efforts of our family in the States, they all got connected. Call it a miracle, because no internet, no cell phones. And they found him and they helped bring him to New York. And so he came to New York. He was roughly 26 years old by that point. Very nice looking guy. He became a bricklayer in New York. Again, that was his craft. He did meet the love of his life, my grandmother Betty, whose family had gone from Poland to Canada during the war. And so he was actually a US citizen before she was. But they met and fell in love, and he ultimately settled and had uh, two children, my father and my uncle, five grandchildren, myself, my two siblings, and our two cousins, and then ultimately one great-grandchild that he got to see before he passed away. So he had a very kind of full, fun life. He liked the simple things. And he ultimately was able to build and construct a family for himself, both of his actual blood relatives that came, and from people he knew from Europe who also came to New York, who also settled in Brooklyn, like he did. And those people became his sort of built family for all of his life. I know I'm taking a lot of liberties to shorten things here. He was very young when the war started and went through quite a bit. But thank you for letting me at least briefly share his experiences. And with that, I'll invite kind of Lauren and Lindsay to jump back in, and I guess we'll take questions.
Yes, thank you, Ariel. Thank you for gifting us with your family story. We're now going to open it up for questions. As a reminder, if you have a question for Ariel, please type it into the Q&A and we'll do our best to address it. If we don't get back to your question, please feel free to email us at events@3gnewyork.org and we'll get back to you later on and as soon as possible. So with that, we will begin our questions. And just to start, Ariel, given you're typically sharing this story in classrooms or in the community, how do students respond when you share your story with them?
Generally, the response is pretty positive. It's a difficult story and there is kind of a lot of meat to it. So, but there's nothing that would be really traumatic for younger students to hear. So I've spoken to a mix of students, probably as young as 8, and as old as 18. But generally a mix of things. Some classrooms are fully radio silent, and really need the time to sort of soak it in. They don't even come with questions. But other students have a ton to say. They find parallels with discrimination that they see or maybe that their parents experienced. Sometimes they're curious about maybe what he would or wouldn't have known in that period. Younger students tend to ask a little bit more about the details of the story, maybe things I didn't get a chance to say, particularly about his youth, but also about me and my youth and my relationship with him. I found older students tend to get curious about kind of the what ifs, like I had somebody ask once when he was um, after the war, did he have any knowledge of the news that was happening in the world? Like, did he know about the world situation at that time? And, those are things I can only speculate about, but they are some of them really interesting questions that even I haven't asked myself or my father. So I've actually learned a lot from speaking to students. Sometimes they ask me things I'm not sure about, which is actually really a great excuse for me to hop on the phone with family and say, "Hey, do you know?" Because I realize I don't. So I feel like in the short time I've been doing this, I'm continuing to learn new things about him, which is great for me because as hard as this is, I kind of feel like I'm visiting with him when I tell it. So it's become not so sad to do. But yeah, sorry, long answer to a short question.
Thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Ariel, did your grandfather feel that there were any specific lessons that he took away from all of his experiences in Auschwitz and the other camps?
So I know you mentioned actually, because I had mentioned it to you guys, that this wasn't a topic I often or ever spoke about with my grandfather as a young child. I didn't want to make him sad. And as I got older, I wanted our relationship to be our relationship and I wanted it to be about other things. So there was nothing that he said, like, I learned this. But certainly there were things in the way he lived his life that I kind of take note of. So, in the telling of the story, I realized that there were things he did, specifics that maybe I didn't mention in this short period, that show a bit of street smarts. So, for example, in the hospital, you wanted to be sick enough to be at rest, but not so sick that they would deem that either you didn't need to live anymore or that they needed to take extra measures. Like if you had a fever, you would get fewer rations so they could starve that out of you. And so one of the things that he and other patients took to doing, because they use mercury thermometers, was they would put them in their mouth and then they'd shake them out a little bit to bring that temperature down. So there was in his story and also in his life this sort of um, overarching theme of kind of looking at your surroundings and using what you have and figuring out how to work what you have in the best way. Certainly one of the things I admire most about him that I don't succeed with in my own life is kind of his really amazing ability to sort of look at what's in front of him and sort of clear the clutter and focus on that as opposed to having all the worry thoughts happening above. And that's not to say he didn't have that. He was human, but the ability to look straight ahead and not dwell, the ability to not hold emotions that weren't serving him, is something that I'm not terribly good at, but I think really served him well. Um, and really the other thing was that he never discriminated for all the anger that I'm sure he had, for all of the difficulties that he went through, for all the loss he experienced. He didn't take it out on any one group or one person. And so I wasn't very good at it tonight, but when I go into schools, I try to be extra mindful that when I talk, I'm talking about the Nazis and not the Germans, because that's how he kind of spoke about it, that there is, at least in his mind, a recognition, and in the way he spoke and in the way I now speak, that there were, the righteous among the nations. There were non-Jews and Jews alike in various circumstances that risked themselves for other people, that helped other people, even that medic that helped him when he was in the infirmary. And so, like, you can't hate everyone. There's no purpose for that. Um, and so for him, it wasn't blanket statements, and it wasn't um ongoing hate or resentment. It was placed where it needed to be. Um, and everybody else, for him, you were a person, and he took you as a person, as your whole self. And if he wasn't into you, it was because of who you were, not because of where you came from. And that was a really pretty amazing thing to see growing up. Um, and it's so that I do, to the best of my ability, I try to absorb all of that into my life. It does seem a little odd in my mind to put someone on a pedestal for these things that became part of them in this really unexpected and really horrible way. Um, but for me, I find a lot of it very honorable, and so that's where I put him.
You mentioned that you didn't talk, an anonymous question, I should say. You said that you didn't talk directly with your grandfather about his Holocaust experience. And so the question is, can you tell us what eventually made you want to talk about it and how that kind of came to be, if you recall?
Yeah. So it wasn't the interesting piece in this is that it wasn't that I never talked about it. It was that I never talked about it with him. But my dad, his son, for my whole life, had shared bits and pieces of his story. So there was never a time in my life that I can recall where I didn't know that this was a part of my grandfather's story. And so largely over the years, if I was going to talk about it, I talked about it with my dad. Now I knew, because I was around when he did it. I was in his house. He had filmed his story for the Shoah Foundation, and so it's recorded. But I never watched it. I was actually, for most of my life, was really afraid to watch it because I was afraid of what I would hear and how horrible it was, and what it would be to hear it from him. And when he passed away, probably about a year after, I decided, like, maybe it was time to hear it from him. And so I watched it, and it wasn't so terrible. Like, there were terrible things, but there was a lot in it that was fine. And so, and that I learned so much more about him. It actually made me upset that I hadn't talked about it with him sooner, because there was so much to know. But ultimately, how I got here was, in those years after he passed, there were a lot of things that I did. I started doing a lot of reading, mostly Holocaust autobiographies. And I sort of say that, like, in a way, there were certain stories that I read where I was kind of looking for him in those stories. Like, I read Primo Levi, who was in Auschwitz around the same time, and I sort of looked for those moments that felt familiar from his story. And at a certain point, a girl I had known in high school, who's also a 3G, had a therapist she was working with who was putting together sort of semi support group sort of thing that I joined. and there were 5 of us, and we would sit around and we would talk about the experiences, what it was to have our grandparents, and what we sort of innately got from them. And I found it very positive, but I also found really intriguing as I was sitting in the room, all I kept thinking was, is I don't think I came out the same way as everybody in the room. Everybody sort of had a bit of um trauma like transferred to them in a variety of ways and for a variety of reasons. Some of them had lived with their grandparents and had seen night terrors and what have you. And I hadn't had that. And it sort of made me question why. And so I spent a lot of time in these last years kind of trying to figure out how I relate to all of this because I felt a little bit other. And ultimately, I kind of stumbled upon 3G on LinkedIn and the WEDU course, and I thought, well, that could be an interesting way to approach this. And I took the class, and it was very helpful in sort of organizing and learning the story better for myself. But it was also a bit of an emotional roller coaster for me that, like, this idea of carrying somebody else's story and figuring out what's important and what's not important. There's a lot of back and forth for me with that. But I did ultimately decide, like, I'll try one classroom and see how it goes. And that classroom was in a synagogue. It was all Jewish youths of around bar mitzvah age, so 12 or 13 years, who were having a Holocaust based curriculum that year. And I spoke, and they were very courteous and very welcoming. And the first question out of the gate was, what is a gas chamber? And I about lost it. I mean, I held it together and I answered the question, but like nobody in that room was reaching, none of the adults, none of the rabbi, not nobody was reaching out to help me. And I remember being really shocked, and not in the good way, that Jewish youths didn't have and this is their history. And so I remember I left, and I went, home, and I called my dad, and I was going through all these feelings. And then I said, like, honestly, after all of this, like, I don't even know if my feelings matter anymore. Like, clearly we need to talk about it, and people aren't, and this is important. And so, like, that's how I got here, but that's how I found my relationship with all of this. Is it really was just really jarring to me, and I couldn't see how, like, this isn't really so far in the past. I mean, and my grandfather was still alive, he'd be 100 years old this year, but it's not that far removed to not know about it. And so, like, had to do something. Like, I had to do something. And he was willing to tell his story. Um, but it's with the Shoah Foundation. I can't say how many people watch that on a regular basis. So it felt a little bit like I would pick up the torch as sort of like 2.0 and do what I think he might have intended, but didn't do in his lifetime.
Thank you so much for sharing that. There's a question in the chat in regards to October 7th. Since you mentioned Israel briefly, Ariele, in regard to immigration, um, when you've gone into schools and such and speaking to students, has October 7th and Israel and Palestine, has that come up from students or in sharing your story? Or has it been very much, a Holocaust focused question?
I'll be honest, in the last year, I have had no students ask me about Palestine or Israel or October 7th or anything related. That's not to say maybe they weren't drawing parallels, but they didn't bring it up with me. The only time I got asked about it was earlier this year. I participated in the Scranton Symposium, which is in Pennsylvania, and it's a 2-day um, consortium that they offer for students all over the state of Pennsylvania to come and hear stories from 3Gs, from 2Gs, and from survivors. And I think he was a reporter for a local paper, had asked me. But that didn't, in all the talks I've given, that doesn't seem to have been kind of on the radar for students. It just wasn't what they honed in on. Usually they were looking more at the personal connection as opposed to the bigger story. I did have one class, actually, my youngest class of like 8-year-olds or 9-year-olds, And they were drawing some connections to Black Lives Matter and discrimination in that regard. But it was only the one class in almost 2 years of speaking.
Sorry. Okay. So I know we have time for maybe two more questions, I'd say. And with that, what one that has come in is the title that you have from Cast Off to Cornerstone. Can you share what that title means to you? And I know you told everyone before the program about the connection to Psalm 118. So if you could explain a little.
Yeah, so at the time that my grandfather passed and we were sitting around as a family and making all of those decisions, uh we ultimately we had to decide what to put on his headstone, and we were a bit at a loss because there are so many things that we felt about him. Like, there wasn't enough space, honestly. And our rabbi at the time actually brought it to our attention, but he cited Psalm 118. And there is a sentence in there that, translated roughly, is something like, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And, it seemed a little bit appropriate, at least superficially, because he ultimately spent his whole life and his whole career as a bricklayer, which was a career that he learned in the camps, essentially. But for us as a family, it felt so appropriate that somebody, that maybe the Germans counted out, that cast off, that maybe should have fallen, and didn't, that he came back. He came back in full force, that he lived a full life, and that he did, at least for me, he did become sort of a very important anchor for our family and our Jewishness. And so it just felt very poetic to put that phrase in the Hebrew on his headstone. And so often when we think about it, and in thinking about this conversation, and not really knowing how to kind of title it, that phrase came to mind. And so that's the origin of it. It comes from Psalm 118.
I guess one last question to close out today. I think I'm going to kind of combine a question I saw that popped up in the chat, but also one from Bria in the Q&A, pertaining to how your family has perceived you going out and sharing your story. And also, has you or your family ever traveled back to Auschwitz or Poland or any of the camps?
So, for the first part, as for the way my family receives this, they've been incredibly supportive. I'm pretty sure all of them are on this Zoom right now, which, it's a good thing I can't see them because it would make me way more nervous. They've been with me the whole way along, and a particular shout out to my dad, because he put up with a lot of very long, very emotional phone calls, asking a lot of questions, not all things he knew the answers to, a lot of conjecture. But they've been incredibly supportive of my doing this. Um, you know, as for going back, um, oddly enough, many members of my family have. I'm not one of them. I haven't gotten there yet. My sister has been to Auschwitz and to Mauthausen. And actually, my grandfather was alive when she went to the camps, and he kind of talked her through what she would see there. And she said, like, it was a little fuzzy, but like everything that he said was there, it was there. And so even though I wasn't with her, the retelling of it from her perspective was really powerful. Before COVID, my parents had um, planned a big trip to Poland, and so they actually went not only to Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, my dad actually knew all the different blocks and bunks that my grandfather had been in. So he actually visited the specific places where my grandfather would have been in the camp. But they also went to Scierpc. They went back to the hometown, using some notes that my dad had from his father, they were able to find the street where the boarding house would have been. They had a really positive experience there. It's still a very small town, so like they met the mayor, and they are the ones, actually the pictures of the birth certificate. They like went to the town hall and they opened this book and they found the birth records. And so I know, at least for my dad, that was very impactful. My grandfather never went back. I think early in his life he couldn't see his way to doing that, and then he got older and he became ill, and he couldn't do that kind of travel. And so I think in their own ways that they've sort of found their way in this story, in doing that. And there may come a time where I make that journey also. I think it's important. I'm not sure, even with all of this, that I'm ready for it. But remarkable to see sort of the continued resilience, and the continued connection, and that it can be and can bring positive memories, and also some educational ones. When my sister went to Auschwitz, she went with her husband and her in-laws, and they are not Jewish, and so it was a bit of a different experience with them, and bringing them through that story. So overall, very positive, not always very easy, but very, very worthwhile.
Thank you, Ariele. Thanks for sharing and answering all those questions. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you again for sharing your grandfather's story. We're so grateful to have you involved with 3GNY. And thank you to Lauren for being an important part of this program, and to the entire Berliner Engelman family for inviting us all to honor the memory of Lillian Berliner together. And thank you again to all of you for joining us. We're so glad you took the time to hear Ariele speak words that must never be forgotten. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat for ways you can donate. Thank you. Also, if you have connections with educators who may want our speakers to present to their classes, please let us know. We have a large speakers bureau of hundreds of grandchildren prepared and ready to present, just like you saw Ariele do tonight. We will send out an email in the coming days with more information, as well as a recording of tonight's program. You can also check out our past WEDU Wednesday speakers and other events on 3GNY's YouTube channel. Thank you again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We are grateful, as always, for your presence and support.